Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You are always training your brain, whether you're aware of it or not. Every thought you allow to repeat, every reaction you give into, every habit you reinforce, it all leaves a mark. The brain is not a fixed structure. It's dynamic, constantly adapting to what you feed it. This means you are shaping your mental reality moment by moment, not just in the big decisions, but in the tiny repetitive behaviors you might consider insignificant. If you complain every day, your brain gets better at complaining. If you avoid discomfort repeatedly, your brain learns that avoidance is the safest, most rewarding option. The more often you think a certain way, the stronger that mental path becomes. That's how habits are built, not only in behavior, but in mindset. Your brain doesn't filter your input based on whether it's helping or hurting you. It only knows repetition. Every time you wake up and choose what you focus on, what you think about, what you give your emotional energy to, you're reinforcing mental patterns. Your patterns become identity. That's why some people feel stuck in anxiety or negativity. They've rehearsed those thoughts so often that they no longer question them. The mind has become conditioned. But the truth is, just as those patterns were built, they can be changed. The key is to understand that your brain is always in training. Just like your body adapts to physical stress, your brain adapts to mental inputs. You are not passively experiencing life. You're actively conditioning your mind every second. If you spend hours scrolling on your phone, jumping from distraction to distraction, you're training your attention to fragment. You're teaching your brain that focus isn't necessary. If you indulge in excuses every time things get uncomfortable, you're training your response to challenge. The brain says, okay, this is what we do when it gets hard. We check out. On the flip side, if you choose to pause, breathe, and respond instead of react, your brain adapts to that too. It starts making that your default. That's the power you hold, not in dramatic one-time efforts, but in everyday repetition. What you tolerate mentally becomes what you train. If you tolerate self-doubt, overthinking, procrastination, or fear without pushing back, your brain will accept it as normal. This is why self-awareness is critical. You have to catch the loops. You have to notice the cycles and consciously decide, this is not the story I want to repeat. But noticing isn't enough. Action is required. If you want a calm mind, you must practice calm, especially when things are not calm. If you want to build confidence, you must take action while you're still uncertain. Confidence is not something you wait for. It's something you condition through repetition. If you want to be disciplined, you must do the hard thing even when you don't feel like it. That's how discipline becomes your default. Every experience you have is feedback. When you avoid something hard and feel temporary relief, your brain gets rewarded and encodes that response. But when you lean into discomfort, stay focused, stay present, and push through, even for 5 minutes, your brain registers that too. You're showing it a new way to respond. You're laying down a new track. Do that enough times and the old tracks begin to fade. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, means that you're never locked into one version of yourself. You're always evolving, for better or worse, depending on what you reinforce. So what are you reinforcing? What are you training? Are you building the mental habits of resilience, focus, clarity, or are you building the habits of fear, avoidance, and passivity? The choice isn't made once a year or at some big turning point. It's made every morning, every moment, every time you choose how to think, feel, and respond. You are always training your brain. The question is, what are you training it to become? Your brain is capable of change. This is not just a hopeful idea. It's a scientific fact rooted in the concept of neuroplasticity. Your brain is not a fixed machine set at birth. It's a living, changing system that adapts based on experience, attention, and behavior. The way you think, feel, and act literally shapes the physical structure of your brain. Every choice you make is a signal. Every repetition strengthens a pathway. The more you act in a certain way, whether that's focusing deeply, reacting with calm, or spiraling into distraction or anxiety, the more those circuits become hardwired. It's like carving grooves into a path. The more the route is used, the easier it becomes to follow. That's why habits become automatic, and also why change feels so hard. It requires building new grooves, not just breaking old ones. But here's what most people misunderstand. Your brain doesn't change just because you wish it to. It changes because of what you do consistently. If you wait for motivation or the perfect mood, you're surrendering your potential to randomness. Your actions are the language your brain understands best. You don't have to feel confident to start acting with confidence. You don't have to be fearless to take action. The brain doesn't wait for emotional readiness. It waits for repeated input. When you act in a certain way, even if it's small, your brain begins to adapt to that version of you. That's how change becomes real, not from thinking about who you want to be, but by acting like that person right now, even if just for 5 minutes. Resistance is part of the process. In fact, resistance is proof that your brain is doing its job, trying to protect you from perceived danger, conserve energy, avoid failure. But just because your brain signals discomfort doesn't mean you stop. The discomfort is not a stop sign, it's a doorway. And each time you step through that discomfort by making a better choice, you send a message to your brain, this is who I am now. Your identity starts to shift. This is why doing one hard thing like getting up early, working out, staying focused, or having a difficult conversation is so powerful. It's not just the act, it's the identity underneath it. You are becoming someone new, someone who chooses action over avoidance, focus over distraction, progress over perfection. The most powerful part, you don't need giant leaps. The brain responds best to consistent incremental change. That's how new patterns get locked in. Tiny improvements done daily build massive rewiring over time. Most people fail not because they can't change, but because they try to change everything at once, then burn out. The truth is, you only need one small decision made repeatedly, one shift in response, one moment of choosing discomfort instead of escaping it, one session of focused work instead of scrolling. These micro decisions stack up. They compound, and eventually they create a new mental operating system. That's the real reset, not a motivational rush, but a neurological recalibration achieved one habit at a time. None of this means it's easy. Your old patterns won't vanish overnight. Your brain is efficient. It prefers the familiar, even if the familiar is hurting you. That's why change feels uncomfortable, because it requires your brain to build new roads and abandon old ones. But discomfort is not failure. Discomfort is the sign that you're doing the work. The more you do it, the more your brain adapts. Over time, what once felt hard becomes automatic. What once triggered fear becomes a non-event. That's the power of consistent rewiring. It doesn't just change how you act, it changes how you feel about acting. And that is real transformation. Small, consistent actions beat intense effort. Most people overestimate the power of big, dramatic changes and underestimate the quiet power of what they do every day. But your brain doesn't need a heroic transformation. It needs consistency, it needs repetition, it needs reliability, because what you do regularly wires the brain far more deeply than what you do occasionally. When you focus on consistency instead of intensity, you stop waiting for motivation and start building momentum. You stop chasing perfection and start training identity. That's when real change happens, not in the loud, inspiring moments, but in the quiet decisions you make when no one is watching. The mind is built through repetition, and repetition creates rhythm. Think of it like physical training. One day of intense exercise doesn't make you strong. It's the habit of showing up again and again, even when it's hard, even when it's boring, even when you don't feel like it. Mental training works the same way. One burst of motivation won't build emotional resilience. One focused session won't transform your attention span. But one choice, repeated daily, creates a mental groove. That groove becomes a pattern, the pattern becomes a habit, and the habit becomes part of who you are. The mistake most people make is trying to overhaul everything at once. They want to wake up earlier, eat better, exercise, journal, meditate, build a business, all starting tomorrow. But the brain doesn't operate well under that kind of pressure. It resists massive change because massive change feels threatening. It wants to keep you in the familiar. That's why starting small is not just easier, it's smarter. When you pick one change, one small manageable behavior, and repeat it, You bypass resistance. You make the new habit safe. And once it becomes safe, your brain allows it to become automatic. Consistency doesn't mean doing everything perfectly. It means showing up. It means keeping the promise, even if it's in a smaller way. If you can't do the full workout, do 10 minutes. If you can't write the full page, write 1 sentence. If you can't meditate for 20 minutes, do it for 2. This isn't lowering standards. This is building a foundation. Because success is not the result of intensity. It's the result of sustainability. Anyone can push hard for a week. Few people can stay steady for a year. But it's the steady ones who win, not because they're better, but because they understood the assignment. Build something that lasts. Each time you choose to show up, even a little, you reinforce a message to your brain. This matters. This is who I am. And the brain begins to build around that identity. That's how confidence grows. That's how focus improves, not from a single moment of inspiration, but from hundreds of micro decisions layered on top of each other until they form a new way of thinking, a new way of feeling, a new way of acting. That's the real reward of consistency. It's not just progress, it's ownership. You stop hoping for change and you start becoming the change. Because the actions you take, no matter how small, are votes for the person you want to become. This is where discipline is born, not from force or punishment, but from practice, from keeping your word, from doing the work even when the work is inconvenient. And the more you practice, the more automatic it becomes. The brain adapts to whatever you do often. So if you want better focus, practice focusing every day. If you want more patience, practice being patient every day. If you want discipline, practice discipline, especially on the days it feels impossible. These moments aren't just tests, they're opportunities. And the more you take them, the stronger you get. Consistency also builds trust with yourself. When you make a promise and keep it, your brain registers safety. It says, I can count on myself. And that internal trust becomes the foundation for everything else. Because when you trust yourself, you don't need motivation to act. You act because you've trained it. You move forward because that's what you do now. Not because it's easy, not because it's fun, but because it's you. And that's how consistency builds not only new habits, but a new identity. Mental habits are powerful patterns that shape the way you experience your life. Most people think habits are only physical, like brushing your teeth, exercising, or checking your phone. But mental habits are even more influential and often go unnoticed. They form in the background of your mind through repetition, just like physical habits do. The way you respond to stress, how you talk to yourself, how you deal with discomfort or failure. These are all habits of the mind. And like any habit, they can be changed, but only if you become aware of them and begin to interrupt their momentum. When something challenges you, your brain doesn't create a brand new reaction each time. It pulls from the patterns you've already repeated. If you usually panic when things go wrong, that becomes your default. If you shut down or run from discomfort, your brain makes that your go-to behavior. These mental reactions become shortcuts, ways for your brain to conserve energy and respond faster. That's efficiency, but it's not always healthy. The problem is that many of these shortcuts are built unconsciously. You're not aware you're building them until they begin to control your responses, limit your thinking, and shape how you see yourself and the world around you. Mental habits are built by repetition, reinforced by emotion, and solidified through unconscious reinforcement. If every time you face a challenge, you tell yourself, I can't do this, or I'm not good enough, those statements start to feel like facts. But they're not facts. They're just familiar thoughts your brain has practiced. The more they are repeated, the more natural they feel. This is how people end up trapped in cycles of doubt, anxiety, or procrastination, not because they're weak or broken, but because their minds have rehearsed certain responses so often that they've become automatic. The incredible part is that you can reprogram these mental habits just like you would with physical ones. You can teach your brain to pause instead of panic, to respond instead of react, to face discomfort instead of fleeing from it. But like all habits, this takes deliberate effort and consistency. It starts with awareness, catching the thought, the reaction, the spiral, and recognizing it as a pattern, not a truth. From there, you begin to change the pattern. You might not feel confident or calm right away, but the moment you make a different choice, you begin to build a new response. That's how mental habits are rewritten. One small decision at a time. Your identity is heavily shaped by these mental patterns. If you're always thinking in terms of fear or failure, that mindset starts to influence what you believe you're capable of. But if you change your inner script, if you begin to respond with curiosity, determination, or self-control, then your mind begins to support those traits. That change doesn't happen overnight, but every time you act in alignment with the person you want to become, your brain starts adjusting its patterns to match. That's not just a motivational concept, it's neurobiology. Most people underestimate how much control they actually have over these habits. They think their reactions are just who they are. But that's not the case. The brain is adaptable. The person who snaps in anger or collapses under stress isn't fixed in that identity. They're just practicing those reactions more than the alternatives. Change begins by interrupting the cycle. And you don't have to do it perfectly, you just have to do it repeatedly. If your mind wants to spiral into overthinking, but you choose to ground yourself instead, that's a win. If you usually avoid difficult conversations, but today you step into one, that's a win. Each win adds to a new mental rhythm. The environment also plays a role. Your surroundings, the people you talk to, the media you consume all influence your mental habits. If you're surrounded by negativity, comparison, or drama, your mind starts absorbing that as its baseline. But if you begin to curate your environment, limit distractions, choose uplifting conversations, and engage in challenging but meaningful activities, your mental patterns shift. The input becomes more constructive, and the output, your thoughts, emotions, and responses, begins to reflect that. Ultimately, mental habits become the architecture of your inner world. They shape how you process reality. And while they may feel invisible, they leave visible effects on everything you do. Your relationships, your career, your health, and your happiness. When you take control of these patterns, you take control of your direction. You must interrupt negative autopilot with conscious, focused action. The mind naturally seeks efficiency, and that often leads to repeating thoughts and behaviors without question. If you've reacted to stress with avoidance for years, your brain will offer that reaction automatically. If you talk down to yourself whenever you made a mistake, your brain registers that as the normal response. These loops don't happen because they're helpful, but because they're familiar. Over time, they become automatic pathways, deeply ingrained, running like software in the background of your life. And the longer they run unchallenged, the more deeply they control how you think, feel, and behave. The problem with autopilot is not that it exists, but that most people don't recognize when it's running. It shows up as habitual worry, overthinking, self-doubt, procrastination, emotional shutdown, or constant distraction. These patterns take over quietly, often triggered by stress or discomfort. The moment something feels uncertain or risky, the brain flips the switch. Retreat to what's known, even if it's unhealthy. This is the mind's attempt to protect you, to conserve energy, to stay safe. But safe doesn't always mean right. The automatic path often leads you away from growth, clarity, and change. And if you don't interrupt it, you end up moving in circles, repeating old responses, reinforcing old beliefs, and staying stuck in the same version of yourself. Interrupting that autopilot requires awareness. You must learn to recognize when your mind is slipping into familiar loops. This is not easy because the patterns feel normal, but that's exactly when the interruption matters most. When you catch yourself thinking in ways that shrink you or reacting in ways that limit you. Maybe it's the internal voice that says, you're not ready. Maybe it's the urge to scroll, to avoid, to give up. In those moments, awareness gives you a choice. You can let the pattern run or you can challenge it. Action is the tool that breaks the loop. You can't think your way out of negative autopilot. You have to move. That movement doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be different from the usual pattern. If you always shut down during conflict, then speaking one calm sentence is an interruption. If you always delay starting, then opening your laptop and doing one task is an interruption. If you always give up when you're tired, then continuing for 5 more minutes is an interruption. These small shifts signal to your brain that a new pattern is possible. The more often you act against the old default, the weaker it becomes. And over time, the interruption becomes the new habit. But this only works when the action is conscious and deliberate. Passive thinking won't rewire your mind. You have to step into discomfort with intention, and you'll have to do it again and again, especially in the beginning, because the old pattern won't vanish right away. Your brain will keep offering it like an old path through the woods, but with every new step, you carve a different trail. Eventually, the new response becomes easier to find. That's how new wiring is built, through choice, through action, through repetition. Another reason action is so important is because it bypasses the emotional resistance that keeps you trapped. Negative autopilot is often fueled by emotion, fear, doubt, shame, or fatigue. When you act despite those feelings, you teach your brain that those emotions aren't in charge. You don't need to feel brave to take action. You don't need to feel ready. You just need to move. And the movement itself starts shifting your emotional state. You gain clarity, you regain momentum. You interrupt not just the thought pattern, but the emotional loop attached to it. The act of interruption also builds self-trust. Every time you step outside the automatic response, you reinforce the belief that you have control, that your habits don't own you, that you can choose a better way. And that belief, once strengthened, becomes a force in itself. It becomes the new baseline for how you respond to the world, not from reflex, but from intention. The more you interrupt, the more you take back control. And the more control you gain, the more power you feel in your everyday decisions. Negative autopilot will always try to return its familiar, and the brain loves familiarity. But with awareness and consistent interruption, those old patterns begin to dissolve. They lose their grip. And what's left is space. Space to choose, to grow, to reset. It all begins with one conscious moment, one decision to do something different, no matter how small. That single action has the potential to change everything. Your brain follows what you rehearse. Every thought you repeat, every emotion you revisit, every behavior you practice, it all becomes part of your mental programming. The brain is not passive. It is constantly learning, adapting, rewiring itself based on the input you give it. And the input it gets the most often becomes the default. If you constantly think in terms of fear, scarcity, or failure, your brain becomes incredibly efficient at producing those thoughts. They begin to feel automatic, even natural, not because they're true, but because they've been rehearsed so many times. The brain doesn't judge whether a thought is helpful or harmful. It simply strengthens what is repeated. That's why the quality of your mental rehearsal is so important. If you rehearse worry, your mind becomes a master at finding things to worry about. If you rehearse comparison, you'll become hypersensitive to what others have and what you lack. If you rehearse avoidance, your brain will default to excuses and distractions whenever you face discomfort. These habits don't just influence how you think, they shape how you see the world. You start interpreting life through a lens that reinforces those rehearsed patterns. Even opportunities can look like threats if you've spent years preparing your brain to expect the worst. Most people don't realize how much control they have over this rehearsal. They think thoughts just happen to them, but thoughts are not random. They are conditioned. When you allow a thought to play on repeat, you are practicing that thought. You are embedding it into your mental circuitry. The same way a musician gets better at playing a song through repetition, your brain gets better at producing certain thoughts the more often you run them. That's how negative self-talk becomes second nature, not because it's accurate, but because it's been rehearsed over and over again. The good news is that this principle works both ways. If you start rehearsing strength, focus, discipline, or resilience, even in small doses, your brain will begin to adapt. If you catch yourself in a spiral of overthinking and instead choose to breathe, refocus, or reframe the situation, you are training your mind to respond differently. At first, it will feel unnatural. The old pattern will feel stronger. That's to be expected. You're working against years of conditioning. But every time you interrupt the old rehearsal and replace it with a new one, you're laying down a fresh path in your brain. And the more often you use that path, the stronger it becomes. This is why it's so critical to be intentional with what you feed your mind. Every thought is either reinforcing the past or building the future. And often it's the subtle daily thoughts that shape you most. The inner dialogue you carry into your workouts, your conversations, your goals, that's rehearsal. The narrative you spin when things go wrong or when you fall behind or when you're alone in your head, that's rehearsal too. If you want to change your mindset, you have to change the script. You have to choose what you want your brain to get good at producing. It doesn't take hours of mental practice each day. It takes consistency. You don't have to perfectly control your thoughts, but you do need to start catching the ones that are dragging you down. Replace them with something better, even if you don't believe it yet. Tell yourself you can stay focused. Tell yourself you can recover. Tell yourself you're still in control. The goal isn't to lie to yourself, it's to retrain your brain. You're not faking anything. You're forging new neural patterns through repetition. This applies not just to thinking, but to action. If you rehearse courage by doing the small, hard things daily, it becomes easier to face bigger challenges. If you rehearse discipline by sticking to a routine, your brain begins to automate that behavior. If you rehearse presence by putting your phone away, focusing on your breath, giving full attention to a task, you rewire your brain to be less scattered. Your practice becomes your personality. Your repetition becomes your response. What you rehearse becomes who you are. Every time you respond to a challenge, a distraction, or a trigger, your brain is watching. It's learning. It's asking, is this how we handle things? And your actions provide the answer. The brain listens more to what you do than what you say. That's why daily mental training matters. Not grand declarations, but consistent repetition. What you rehearse, you remember. What you remember, you repeat. And what you repeat becomes your mental operating system. Discomfort is training ground. It is the place where growth is born, where mental strength is forged, and where your true capacity is revealed. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort, assuming that ease equals success and that difficulty is a sign something is wrong. But that belief is one of the greatest lies the brain can tell. Discomfort is not danger. Discomfort is adaptation. The same way muscles grow under tension, your mind grows under challenge. The more often you expose yourself to controlled discomfort, the more resilient, focused, and emotionally stable you become. It doesn't happen by thinking about change. It happens by standing in the fire of discomfort and not running away. Your brain has one core directive to keep you alive and safe. It's wired to detect threat, to avoid risk, to protect you from pain, physical, emotional, and even imagined. So when you step into discomfort, your brain will resist. It will signal fear, hesitation, procrastination, or fatigue. It will tell you to stop, to turn back, to find relief. But relief is not always what you need. Relief in the short term often leads to regret in the long term. The decision to push through, to stay with the discomfort, to move forward when everything in your body says stop, is where mental toughness is built. It's not just about willpower. It's about training your nervous system to stay calm and composed in the face of tension. Discomfort can show up in many forms. It might be waking up early, saying no to distraction, confronting a difficult truth, committing to deep focus, or holding yourself accountable when no one is watching. These are not grand moments, but they are essential ones. Every time you lean into these moments, you're teaching your brain something new, that discomfort is not to be feared, but faced, that it is not a threat, but a teacher, and that on the other side of it lies strength, clarity, and capability you didn't know you had. The reason discomfort is so powerful is because it reveals the gaps between who you are and who you want to become. It shows you where your limits are, not so you can stay behind them, but so you can train past them. You can't guess your capacity by staying comfortable. You discover it by doing something difficult, failing, adjusting, and doing it again. That process isn't glamorous, it's raw, it's repetitive, it's uncomfortable, but it's also the process that separates those who grow from those who stay stuck. In moments of discomfort, the mind will always search for a way out. It will offer distractions, excuses, and rationalizations. It will whisper, "You can do it tomorrow," or "You're not ready." But that's exactly when you must act. The ability to override that internal resistance, even briefly, begins to shift the entire structure of your mental habits. You are not just completing a task, you are building a reputation with yourself. You are saying, I do hard things, I don't retreat when it gets tough, I train through the storm. The beauty of discomfort is that it compounds. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once triggered fear becomes just another part of the process. Your nervous system adapts, your focus sharpens, your emotional control increases. But it only happens if you return to the edge often enough. Most people touch discomfort and then run, but the ones who stay long enough to understand it, those are the ones who grow. Discomfort isn't a one-time test, it's a lifestyle choice. It's the willingness to show up again and again, not despite the challenge, but because of it. When you seek discomfort on purpose, in your training, your learning, your discipline, you are conditioning your mind to become stronger than your circumstances. You're no longer at the mercy of how you feel. You're no longer dependent on motivation. You're driven by purpose. And that purpose acts as your anchor when the mind wavers, because it will waver. The discomfort will not go away, but your relationship to it will change. It will go from being a signal to stop to being a signal to begin. It will become the space where you transform. Discomfort doesn't guarantee immediate success, but it guarantees growth. And growth is what leads to everything else. Clarity, confidence, discipline, fulfillment. The path to that growth is built on repetition. Not comfort, not ease, but the disciplined act of showing up, leaning into the edge, and trusting that with every rep, your mind is becoming stronger than it was yesterday. You don't need motivation to act. Motivation is unreliable, inconsistent, and often absent in the moments when you need it most. People wait for it, chase it, try to spark it through videos or quotes, hoping that one powerful feeling will push them into action, but that feeling fades. What you need instead is structure, intention, and the ability to move forward regardless of how you feel. Motivation is emotional. It depends on mood, environment, energy, and circumstance. But action, especially disciplined, focused action, can and must happen without emotional permission. The key is learning to act despite resistance, and to do so regularly until that action becomes part of who you are. Waiting to feel motivated is a trap. It gives power to your emotions and makes your actions conditional. If you're only productive when you feel like it, your progress will always be inconsistent. The truth is, the brain adapts faster to routine than it does to emotion. If you wake up at the same time every day, your body and mind begin to expect it. If you focus at the same hour in the same place, your attention sharpens more quickly. If you train yourself to act, even when your thoughts are negative or your energy is low, you begin to prove something powerful to your mind. Feelings are not the boss, structure is. Routines act as anchors, they remove decision fatigue, they create momentum. The moment you create structure around your priorities, you eliminate the space for overthinking. You don't ask, do I feel like it? You just do it because it's part of the system you've built. Structure is not limitation, it's freedom from mental chaos. It gives you a framework to succeed even on your worst days. When everything else feels uncertain or overwhelming, your structure remains. It gives you something to stand on. Intention fuels that structure. Intention is what reminds you why you're doing what you're doing. It turns routine from a mechanical process into something meaningful. Without intention, structure becomes mindless repetition. But when you infuse your actions with purpose, when you remind yourself that your daily habits are shaping your future, then even the small, difficult actions take on weight. Intention connects discipline to identity. It reinforces the truth that you're not just going through the motions, you're becoming someone. And the person you become is shaped not by what you feel, but by what you consistently choose to do. Action is what reclaims your power, especially when you don't feel like doing anything. The moment you take action, however small, you interrupt the loop of procrastination and doubt. You stop feeding the narrative that says you're stuck, lazy, or behind. You replace it with evidence. You moved forward. That one piece of evidence shifts your emotional state, builds confidence, and creates momentum. And momentum is often stronger than motivation. Once you're in motion, staying in motion becomes easier. You don't need to conquer the mountain. You just need to take the first step, then the next. Repetition transforms that action into habit. And habit is what frees you from needing to negotiate with yourself every day. You don't argue with your mind. You follow the protocol you've trained. That's the power of automaticity. You put the decision-making on autopilot so that your brain doesn't waste energy fighting itself. It just executes. And each execution adds another brick to the foundation of who you are. That identity becomes stronger than your excuses. You stop asking yourself how you feel and start asking yourself what needs to be done. Taking control of your time, your energy, and your mindset doesn't begin with the perfect plan. It begins with doing the hard thing once, then doing it again. You build discipline like you build muscle through resistance, through repetition, through days when you don't want to show up, but you do it anyway. That's when you grow. Not when it's easy, not when you're inspired, but when it's inconvenient and you do it anyway. That's the real test. And that's where transformation happens. Ultimately, your ability to act without motivation becomes your superpower. It separates you from those who wait for the perfect conditions. It builds trust in yourself. It gives you the confidence that no matter what life throws at you, you know how to move forward, one step at a time, not based on emotion, not based on energy, but based on commitment. And when commitment becomes your default, nothing can stop you.